Hey everyone, and welcome to the At the Movies After Show. It's our first movie, and Evan's getting hyped up already for that.
Yeah,
And
this
we
is in the classroom. This is I agree or I'm excited, you know.
oh okay, yeah, I thought that was like a surfer like hang loose type of thing, and I was like, that's a
A hint to the movie or not at all.
oh yeah, a little Midwest surfer action going on from the Illinois man. Well, as you can probably tell already, we're going to try to keep things a little bit loose and fun for this. We're just have a conversation about the week's movie, about the movies. Not so much diving into the actual movie, which was Captain America: Civil War. Yeah, yeah.
Which Evan has not seen, for the record, which may be the only human being in the world that hasn't seen it. But go ahead, keep going, John.
I've I've now seen many clips and
Mhm.
understand the deeper meanings
Oh yeah,
therein the film.
see
It's
it.
true.
But go ahead,
You're able
John.
to you're able
Go
to
ahead.
gain some truth there.
Hmm.
And for those that haven't had a chance to catch it at the movie, what happens is we connect clips from a movie and then clips from a teaching pastor. This last week was Mark, who combined some different biblical spiritual truths with those movie clips as a way of like illustrating in just a little bit of a different way, because everybody learns in a little bit of a different way, and this was like kind of a fun, creative of way of kind of teaching some really practical, important lessons. And it's a great opportunity to invite people and have fun going to service and eating some popcorn. You don't have to have watched at the movies in order to gain something from this conversation, because we're going to kind of share a lot of the practical things that are going to come out of it. But if you did, we hope you enjoyed both. So
E- Either one of two things. Either you haven't seen the movie at all and you can resonate with me, or you haven't seen the at the movies version of it and we can still have a discussion. Everyone is welcome.
it's perfect, just like at the Ridge, right? Everyone is welcome.
Hmm.
Well, hey, okay, so you're Mark. Start off with this one. You're watching a movie for At the Movies, which I'm
Hmm.
sure it must be tough. It must have been real tough to I got to work a little bit turning on Captain America: Civil War. That was must have been a real struggle for you.
It's
um,
actually harder than you think.
yeah, tell me about that process. Tell us about
Yeah,
that.
it's harder than
How
you
do
think.
you
First off,
pick up on
it is
stuff?
great. All right, it is great. I'm not gonna lie, it's great, and I love Marvel, so I mean that was even better.
Yeah.
But when I watch a movie, it is just for entertainment purpose. I'm not going like, hey, what's the meaning of this?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not watching Marvel movie for that. I'm like, hey, what's happening? What's gonna happen next? And all that stuff. And then, when you put the at the movies hat on, then it's themes and meanings and connections. And that is it's tough. And so when I put on my that hat, the ATM hat, to watch Civil War in that through that lens, it was like, holy smokes, there's a lot here, a lot here. And in fact, the toughest thing was just narrowing it down. Not even the clips, even though that was really challenging for a 2.5 hour movie, but just there was many themes we did not cover or could have gone a lot further with.
I'm curious, was that like you're trying to pick the ones that resonate the most? What does that narrowing down process look like? Is that
Yeah,
like what's
I
connecting
try
with you,
to
or
it's different for every movie, but I have now tried to take not one theme necessarily, but two or three, and try to just kind of embed them into the overall message itself. That's what I try to do, and it's got to, I think, fit the flow of the movie overall. Because it'd be weird if you're going back and then all that stuff. I think that would be kind of weird. So it's a mix of that, which that's what makes it difficult.
for sure? So one of the things that you mentioned, and really, I mean, obviously, it makes sense. The movie's called Civil War, was on disagreements. I mean, obviously, that's something that I think our whole world could, especially right here in America right now, could really dive into and learn a couple things from. But maybe you could share some of the things as we try to get practical with this. What are some practical ways when you think about the topic of disagreement that you've experienced? Like, okay, here's what I found super helpful.
Yeah, I think this is going to sound, when you watch Civil War, that's kind of the amazing thing about it. You're like, especially if you're a Marvel fan, you're like, okay, these guys are in the trenches together and they're fighting with each other, or they're fighting together for the good of humanity. And then all of a sudden, Civil War, it takes a simple disagreement and it builds and it grows. And all of a sudden, they're fighting against each other. And the fight scenes on that, you're like, whoa, this is actually happening. And
Yeah.
so you go, wow, it doesn't take much. And we think, oh, that won't happen. No, no, it just builds, 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 builds. And so some of the practical, John, you were saying the practical things
Yeah.
to do when that happens,
Yeah.
when disagreement happens. I think the key is if you're a Jesus follower, you got to ask the question. And the question is, do I take following Jesus seriously?
Mhm.
And because if you do, then this becomes a lot easier thing to deal with. If you don't, if you're like, oh yeah, I do, or I believe, but I don't really follow, then it becomes much harder. Because if you take following Jesus seriously, then one of the most important things of following Jesus is how we treat other people. Love one another. Everyone's made in the image of God. We're all on equal footing. All that stuff. Being the relationship being right is more important than being right. I mean, all those things kind of flow from that. And so if you really take your faith seriously, then it makes it a lot easier. Then I go, okay, even if I'm right, that's not the most important thing. That person is. And if I'm wrong and it's hurting the relationship, oh, because God did that for me, I need to do that for others. It just makes it a lot easier to do, even as difficult as it is to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that in our day and age, like right now in our relationships, we kind of hide behind our screens in some
Mhm.
of our disagreements. And when I think of practical application for this, it would be in your disagreements, become proximate. Like it's really hard to remain in disagreement with someone that you're around all the time, or unless you're really good at being passive aggressive in public settings. And there are some people that are immensely talented at that. Um,
Well, I mean, people get bold. They get bold behind a screen or on social media, typing something up. I've had people do that. Then I've approached them and I say, "Hey, I noticed you did. Hey, when you said this about," and they're like, "Oh, well, yeah," and they start to back off and all that stuff. I mean, very, very common, very
I
common.
meant no offense. Well, but what you wrote down on your screen was really offensive.
Yeah. I don't think
Mhm.
anybody who's ever heard the words "no offense" and then a statement has been said afterwards was like, "Oh yeah, that feels great. I feel fine."
That's right. That's right. I'm sorry, Evan, you were saying something.
No, no, all due respect, but here's a really disrespectful comment. Here you go. No, just kidding.
No, you
Well,
were mentioning like the Evan. You're mentioning about being close to somebody and kind of removing some of that barrier. Is there like a general rule of thumb you apply for like disagreements when it comes to like technology side of things?
Like for me personally, I've had some stuff where it's like, a text exchange starts turning into a more serious conversation. And I like to end those by just saying this needs to be a face-to-face conversation. This is not a text conversation right now. And because I think for me as well, like I can become really passive aggressive in my texting. It's like my sarcasm comes out in my typing. Also, like in your relationships, if you're talking about what's texted or what you see in an email, maybe your work relationships, like it's so hard to understand intent behind what's written rather than what you can read in someone's body language, in their face. It's so much better when you can disagree in person.
yeah, Evan, that's so well said. We have one of the things like with the campus pastors and stuff, we've been talking about how to deal with some of the hot topic issues when they're brought our way. And so I was talking with someone who was wrestling with one of those hot topic issues, and they said, "Well, how come the church doesn't have things on their website about this?" And I said, "Well, here's why: because we personalize these things. That these aren't just statements that we write. These are people and stories, and there's a lot more that goes into it. So with these things, we always bring someone in to have a conversation because we want to hear their story, and we want them to hear our heart." And it was interesting, even in having that conversation, this person was like, "Oh, I get it." I get it. I was like, yeah, man, personalizing it is critical in a day and age where it's so easy to keep things impersonal, and it often makes things worse.
Yeah, I feel like that especially comes to the forefront. I think when you're having like political type of conversations where somebody may have taken opinion and their opinion is almost about a theoretical concept of something rather than like maybe even an issue that's super close to the home, or they have like a principle based on why they have that political leaning. And I think something that you mentioned um, over the weekend was the importance of being curious and trying to hear somebody's story and how that can like shift a little bit about your priority in the conversation. Would you share a little bit more about that?
Well, I think I heard this past week. I forgot who said it, so forgive me for not giving credit. It was where you sit determines what you see. And so what that means is that we automatically go into things in a conversation like that with a very limited perspective because where we sit is what we see. And the reality is we don't sit everywhere. And the person we're talking to most likely sits in a very different spot, and so they see differently. And that should inform us, or at least when we go into conversations like that, or even deal with issues where people disagree, that we go in with this idea of curiosity because they're sitting someplace different that we don't know. And here's the thing, if we say, well, I don't know why they feel this way, well, then there's something we don't know. We should be curious. And we should go into it with that type of curiosity rather than, well, I can't believe they believe this. Well, if you can't believe it, then once again, there's something you don't know. And so go in it with that type of curiosity.
Yeah, I like the phrase, help me understand. I feel like I say that to my kids often. Maybe not too much in my friendships or relationships, but I could see how in like just a big disagreement with somebody, just that phrase can be helpful. Like
That's good.
not to make you do the work. Like I need to do work in the process, not make you do it for me. But like you said, like there's things that I don't know. There's things that I don't see.
Yeah, and I think there's a real fear of, well, what if I'm wrong? Nobody wants to admit that they're wrong. Okay. So it's like, hey, what if I learned something here that maybe exposes something about my belief system that might be incomplete or whatever it might be? And what if I'm wrong? That's okay. That's okay. Your worldview just expanded. That's okay.
I mean, this may be a super tough question. I'm curious either of your perspectives on this, but I think, and we've talked about something along the lines before, but everybody, I mean, hates to be wrong. I mean, I hate to be wrong. I'm sure both of you hate to be wrong. But how do we become okay with that? And that's like almost like fighting against the nature, right? It's like, hey, you know what? It's okay if you were wrong. Just don't stay there. How do you get to that place?
You've been wrong more than me, so you start with this one.
That's for sure.
Give your testimony.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, Mark, I think what you had said in your message, even when we were recording it, I was, I had to restrain myself because I'd be picked up in the audio of like giving you an amen as you were recording. And I would phrase it this way. You phrased it a little bit differently, but it's you talked about your relationship and your relationship being right. Do we care more about being right than we do about the relationship? And so the way I would put it is, it's better to be kind than it is to be right. So again, with my kids, sometimes they just may get to something where they'll say like, no, this is what it is. And I'm over here like, I have years and years of more wisdom than you do. But you know what? It's better to be kind than it is to be right. In the grand scheme, what does it really matter? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Let's talk about it again in 3 days and I'll tell you that you're wrong.
It is interesting because I think there's two things that drive our wrongness or our fear of wrongness, and pride. Obviously, we get that one. Okay, and I think the pride really comes from, well, what do we think we're losing? I mean, 'cause that's what we're afraid of. We're like, well, I'm going to lose something by admitting I'm wrong. Okay, well, what is it? And then the other thing is fear. And what am I afraid of? And there, in this case, they're a little bit combined, but there can be some other things that just come to the surface when we just really begin to go, okay, God, what is there a fear here, or what's the pride here? And then to deal with the root of it, because I guarantee you, it's not just this instant. It's more than just this, and it's probably a pattern that is coming out, but it's just coming out in not admitting that we're wrong.
No, I think that's super wise, because I think when you understand like the underlying like cause of something, like, okay, well, what does it mean if I can't admit that I'm wrong? It's because of these things. It's like, then you have something practical that you can actually work on, right? Because all of a sudden it's like, hey, if I'm reading a book or listening to a podcast or having a conversation with a close friend who's really good about showcasing humility, like then you can actually address the things that are causing that versus being like, well, I just need to not do that. It's like, well, that doesn't really help anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
If somebody wanted to work on, we'll take the topic of pride. How it's a dangerous prayer, right? God help me be less proud. Evan was praying that, and I think it's working. But
it's not working. But keep going. You need to pray more.
How, like, is there a practical thing that you can start to do to start to work on that pride?
I deal with, especially with my DISC score and Enneagram score, all the personality scores. They all have a shadow side or dark side, whatever whatever you want to call them. Okay. And so admitting wrong, pride bubble up pretty high in mine. Okay. Because it's like, hey, let's go. And hey, but what about this? Who cares? Let's go. And so, for me, it's really come down to over the years going, do I really believe that God opposes the proud? And so if he does, that's pretty serious. In other words, you mean I could have God working against me because that's how he feels about pride in my life. And it's not because it's not because he doesn't love me. It's actually because he does love me. He knows the damage it's doing not only to me, but those around me. And so for me, I've just finally said, man, I don't, life is hard enough. I don't want that. And he gives grace to the humble. So you know what? I want that. I want that. I want to be working with God and not having him work against me. So for me, John, it really has finally come down to, do I really believe that? And I've been around it long enough to go, yes, I have. I mean, I'm not older than Evan, but I'm getting there. Okay. So that's where I land with that.
we might need to check the tape on that one.
A lot of great.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I heard an author, John Mark Comer, recently talk about this idea of a vow of obscurity. And especially for those in ministry leadership, as it pertains to pride, because I don't know if anyone checks out the ministry news, if there's such a general topic, but there tends to only be one type of ministry news, and it's that another pastor has fallen. A mistake has come out. It seems like it just kind of happens over and over and over again. And that's kind of what John Mark Comer was talking about was, where are all the people that have decided I'm going to commit to a life of obscurity because I don't need these factors of what I've done has notoriety or when I do this thing, a lot of people see me do it. We have a lot of pride kind of collected up in the things that we do and that we do well. But when was the last time we did something well and didn't look for everyone's praise from it? Is some of our things that we're doing well honoring the fact that God has given us that desire and that ability, and being willing to live a little bit more of life in obscurity rather than taking on praise in all of the things that we do and maybe do well in our lives.
Yeah. And I Evan, just hearing you say that, it is when you look at all those stories of fallenness, okay, and I don't want to ministry fall. I don't want to point fingers because it can happen to any of us. Okay. So not to point fingers, but somewhere along the line, they had to think this could never happen to me, or that I'm beyond this or something along that line. So there is a pride element of that, which relates then to all of us to go, when we're full of pride or we're acting in pride, we have elevated ourselves beyond where we should be. And we've elevated our value of how we see ourselves beyond what we should be, because we've elevated ourselves above others in some way. And so pride is really a perspective issue. It's really ugly. I think that's why, God opposes the pride. It's just, there's a lot of ugliness in pride for sure.
I think hearing both of you share, I'm kind of like drawn to two, I think, practical steps if somebody wants to kind of develop that in their life. One, it sounds like take on opportunities where you're doing something good for others and no one else sees. What's a way you can serve others and no one else is going to see it? Because there's no glory, right? That's just you doing something because it's a good thing to do. Yeah. And then two, and Mark, you're talking about perspective. How do you begin to truly see the value in others and recognize that no one's more valuable than you, or the opposite of that?
You're talking to me.
Sorry, I'm just so wired to think that. You know what I mean? Yeah. But how do you start to develop that perspective? And something that you've consistently shared, Mark, is not to elevate your pride over there, but the prayer, God, give me a heart for others. And I think it's really hard to be strongly focused on others and in that same moment have pride for yourself. Mm-hmm. Which
is why it's so hard to have a heart for others. It fights against that. I mean, it does. It combats it straight on, and there's the tug of war right there.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Well, hey, we're going to wrap up here. Curious if you guys have any closing thoughts on week 1 of At the Movies.
Maybe I'll go watch the movie. That's a closing word for you. I will say, if you weren't a huge fan of the movie from week 1, if you're anything like me, you will truly enjoy week 2.
Ooh.
And I'll just say, in the vein of pride, I nailed it. No, I'm just saying, I'm kidding. Man, it's such a great. If you haven't seen it, see it. As far as At the Movies thing, and I know there's some options on how you can still see it. And man, just this topic about being right and relationships being right, it's a big deal, especially moving forward. So, man, dig into that and understand just the seriousness of it. And why God it's so important to God, and it should be important to us.
That's so good. And I mean, maybe a final closing from me is, if you were there last week, you saw how fun it was just to be in that room eating popcorn with people and that experience. And we'd love for you to grab a friend and bring them with you, because we think that they're really gonna enjoy the series and just experience a different way of being a part of a church service. So see you all next week for next week of week 2 of At the Movies.